Today we'll be painting a warrior of the dead, a man of the White Mountains, an oath breaker. Today I will show you a new technique for the channel called Zenithal undercoating. We shall spray our miniature black first, and then paint on an off-white colour to the upper areas of the model. For this instance, a makeup brush was used. What we are doing here is preparing our model before layering down our coloured paint in the next step. This will create both darker areas and lighter areas to be seen when the model is finished. We will be using Army Painter's speed paints today, and to start off, Malignant Green was applied to the majority of the miniature. We want a nice even coat here, and by not adding too much we'll avoid the paint pooling in any of the recesses. Some areas such as the chainmail, the skin and the sword were not painted at this stage. This was left to dry, and a second thinner layer was applied using Malignant Green and some water. This was added to some of the areas to get a better coverage. Here I focused on some of the upper areas to make them less pale green in colour, due to the white undercoat. If you want them brighter, then skip the second coat altogether. Now that we have our base layer done, we shall start adding some shaded areas to the miniature. Firstly, some Absolution Green was mixed with some water, around about a 50-50 mix. This was then applied to the folds of the cloth and the recessed areas. Now, speed paint potentially can be reactivated when applying a new layer on top of it, and it can reactivate to water. So you can either spray the miniature with a coat of varnish in between the layers, and this will protect each layer. This is time consuming and it doesn't feel like you are speed painting a miniature. Or you could do what I did, throw caution to the wind and just start painting the next layer. What I found is that if you apply gentle brush strokes and not keep brushing the same area multiple times, then you can apply the paint without worry of reactivating the previous colour and making a mess. But I always strongly suggest to do a test miniature first to see how you go. Finally, for the shield, we will have a gradient from light to dark, so this paint was only applied to the bottom half. For the final shade, Dark Wood, again mixed with water, was used and painted into the recesses only, to give that dirty, ethereal look. Now, I should note, for the purpose of making this video, I used a hairdryer between layers to speed up the drying time, so that I could paint this individual miniature quicker. However, you could paint a batch of these, say 10 at a time, and by the time you have painted the last one, then the first one should be dry enough for the next paint. That way you will have a warband of these done in no time. Dark Wood was also applied to some areas such as the hair, face and also onto the edges of the chainmail. This effectively creates a pre-shade to these areas before we apply other paints, to give it some further depth. And again, for the shield, only the bottom third was painted this time. We don't need to go as high as our previous green layer. We are now ready to add some additional colour for our warrior. To start off this section, we will focus on the metals. Runic Grey mixed with a bit of medium was added to the chainmail and sword. From the speed paint review, check out the other video if you haven't seen it already, we know that using some medium will make the paint settle into the recesses better, and also creating that highlighted look by being more translucent on the edges of the sculpt, which is what we will be after for the helmet and the body armor. By prodding the brush multiple times in a certain area, this will reactivate the speed paint layer underneath, and allow some of our white Zenithal Basecoat to be shown on the edges. And this will create some highlights for us in the process. For some extra colour, 𝗲𝗵𝗄𝗏, mixed with water, was then applied to the chainmail armour. Now, remember earlier when I mentioned by brushing gently, this will avoid any potential reactivating? Throw that advice out the window for the shield. We will paint with a bit more pressure applied, and this will start to take the paint away from the edges and form natural highlights for us, as you can see here. Lastly, some of this purple was again prodded onto the breastplate as well as the helmet. This bit of colour is a good way to subtly break up the miniature, so that it isn't all one tone of colour. Now, let that dry and we shall add some extra details using our speed paints. The skin was painted first with pallid bone. This was intentional to give it that pale, grim look to it. The paint was applied straight from the bottle with no thinning required. And then a small amount of Crusader skin mixed with a bit of water was applied to the recesses to create that reddish shade look. This was applied to the sides of the face as well as in between the fingers. Again, just poke the brush onto the areas and let the water do the work for you. The beard was then painted. Again, opting for more of a striking colour here. It gives the eye more to focus on and it just adds a bit more character to the miniature. And whilst the hair was drying, the leather areas were given a layer of dark wood. As this is one of the darkest paints, I would suggest to be slow and careful at this point. Try not to get any onto the green clothed areas that we have already done. Here we want the straps and the sword scabbard to have a full layer of this brown. Just for some added shade and detail, a thin line was painted along the recesses of the cloth and the armour. Hopefully you can see how versatile this range of paints can be. So my question of the day to you is, what miniatures do you have where you would like to try these speed paints on? As always, please do share your thoughts in the comments. And this dark wood paint was also used for the lines in the shield. Now onto the sword. Gravelord Grey with a bit of medium was applied with a thin coat to the sword in small areas. A non-metallic look is what we are going for here. Now normally I would just use the metallic paints from the range, but I wanted the overall aesthetic of this warrior to be ethereal looking, and to half exist on a corporeal plane. So he wouldn't be carrying a metallic sword, but the form of one instead. Notice that the areas are painted on each half of the sword in an alternative fashion. This is the starting point for that traditional non-metallic look that you see on miniatures. Let the paint dry for a moment, and then apply another layer of grey, but this time only to cover half of the previous layer, so that you start getting a bit of a transition from dark to light. Holy White was applied onto the lighter areas of the sword, and slightly over the first layer of our Gravelord Grey paint. Remember, because of how translucent the paint is, you will see a small amount of the previous layer underneath. So, once completed, we have made a gradient of paint from light to dark, which is exactly what the overall look was intended to be. Now, just using speed paints, our warrior is looking good and ready for battle. You can stop here, and if you are batch painting these, you will get your warband ready in no time. However, I like to give choices, just like Morpheus did with Neo. In the left hand is our speed painted warrior, and in my right hand, there have been some additional highlights added. If you want to jump down this rabbit hole with me and see how this is done, let's continue. We will be switching over to our normal paint range now, and first, necrotic flesh was added to the hands and face. Here, only a small amount of paint is needed to highlight the knuckles and the eye socket respectively. The beard then had elven flesh applied to the upper areas. And with these two quick highlights, we already have some added interest to our miniature. Some slightly watered down monster brown was added to the scabbard. Here only the upper section was painted, allowing the dark wood paint to still be seen in the darker areas. And this was followed up with a highlight of kobold skin to both the scabbard and the belt. Now, my favourite highlight for the miniature, and that is white for the metals. This will make the edges stand out even more and give the details a sharper look. The paint was applied to the edges of the chainmail and for the shield. Whilst painting the shield highlights, they were focused mainly around the corners and the bottom edge. This gave a transition from the bright white to the natural highlight that the speed paints created earlier. This white was also used for the chest armor as well as the helmet. Again, this is to define the edges a bit more, and it also separates the materials that are on the miniature, such as the cloth and the armored areas. And for the sword, this was highlighted everywhere. Using this white will trick the eye and make the darker areas seem even darker. If you use the edge of the brush rather than just the tip, it would make it easier to pick out the edges of the sword. And finally onto our tatty looking robes. By mixing up the highlights with general brush strokes and also prodding the brush in an irregular fashion, this gives the impression of a tattered old cloth. Remember, these guys are long dead. As you can see, by adding some highlights to the model, it does add that extra interest. And it's up to you to decide if you have the time or indeed wanting that sharper look to the model. So we have seen what the speed paint range can do, and for even more cool tips and tricks about the paints, be sure to check out this lovely video here. And please do turn on the bell if you have subscribed, so you don't miss a video and you can be notified when the next one is ready just for you. And as always, thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.